Welcome to the African People Podcast. This podcast is about Africa, regarding the political side, the historical side, the economical side, the cultural side, and so many more. Each week, I deliver my best thought and analysis regarding Africa. Here, your host, Amaduba. Today, I have a special guest with me here. His name is Judd Devermont. He's the Director of Africa Program at Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you so much, sir, for joining me this week on African People
Oh, it's
Podcast,
my
sir.
pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, sir. Can you tell us Can you tell us a little bit background about U.S. Africa policies?
Sure. U.S. policy in Africa has gone through a number of twists and turns over the almost 7 decades now. But let me focus just a little bit on what it's looked like in the Cold War, post-Cold War period, and then we can end with President Trump. But there's been a largely consistent policy towards Africa since the end of the Cold War, a focus on democracy, a focus on security, a focus on development, and finally a focus on, I think, trade, investment, economic opportunity. These have carried through Republican and Democratic administrations since the end of the Cold War. I would argue that that has not been exactly the case with President Trump. His focus, number one, is on countering China
Mhm.
and Russia and trade and investment. There is talk, if you look at the strategic documents on U.S. policy, about security, but in general, it's not been a focus. In fact, there's a talk of pulling troops out of West Africa, and most of the documents don't talk at all about democracy and governance. And I know
Mhm.
you're aware, Amadou, of some of the things that President Trump has done that have been very negative towards Africa, whether it's disparaging comments, imposing
Mhm.
trade bans, taking away the ability for countries like Rwanda to be
Mhm.
involved in the secondhand clothing market. So there's been a number of things that I think have really hurt U.S. African relations and that are a departure from previous administrations. Just one
Mhm.
final note: this president has engaged with Africa less than any of his predecessors, dating all the way back to John F. Kennedy. He's
Mhm.
only welcomed two sub-Saharan African leaders to the White House: President Kenyatta of Kenya and President Buhari of Nigeria.
Yes, that's really a good point, said. Especially at this moment, the Trump administration is really, really different from the previous administration, sir. So, in general, sir, what is your view about U.S. Africa policies?
What is my view,
Yes,
specifically with President Trump or in general?
in general.
Well, in general, I think that the US and African countries have strong relations, mutual respect, and a view that what is good for Africa is good for the United States. Enlightened self interest is a way that US government officials talk about their foreign policy. And I think that together, US and African countries and African publics, so both governments and publics, have made incredible strides when you're talking about AIDS, HIV, or dealing with democracy or advancing democracy or security issues. I think that that has been, again, less of the case under President Trump. But I am bullish on the relationships between Africa and the U.S., and I think that they will continue to be strong. In fact, if you look at polling, Africa as a region relative to the rest of the world remains the United States remains very popular.
Hmm. Yes. So just let's talk about because we have been seeing China is almost taking over Africa, kind of. I'm not gonna say they already take over, but kind of. So do you think so? US should bring something different to the table because China has been bringing a lot of things different to the table.
Yeah, I don't think that China is taking over Africa. So let's be very specific about what's happening.
Okay.
That China, since has had a long history on the continent, mainly all the way going back and since the revolution in 49, focused on building relationships, sending its workers to build a railway between Zambia and Tanzania. But in the 2000s, with the going out policy, they really ramped up what they were doing in terms of investments and relationships with the continent. And they now, in 2009, surpassed the United States in terms of trade and investment. In terms of foreign direct investment, the US is probably still ahead because of stock investments, but year on year, China is making much more serious gains. So I think that the Chinese have been focused on infrastructure investments, roads, rails. They're getting into tech in some countries, But I think the U.S. has a number of strengths, and it's sector specific. So I think the U.S. is particularly a good partner when it comes to services, when it
Mhm,
comes to financial,
mhm,
accounting, etc., when it comes to agro processing, so higher level agricultural outputs. And then I would add tech and medical. Now, the US doesn't make PPEs per se, but we have a very robust industry when it comes to medical medicine, medical equipment, and I think that's another place where we could grow. In terms of
mhm,
diplomacy, China is probably doing a better job on diplomacy. They have their triannual event called FOCAC, which is was last in Beijing. It will be in Dakar allegedly next year. The U.S. doesn't do that kind of event. In fact, they've only done it once in 2014. So I think that's another place where the U.S. really needs to ramp up in terms of engaging both with African leaders, but with the African public.
mhm. Talking about African leaders, because I like we said, now if we're talking about U.S. Africa policies, we have to talk about China, especially China is challenging U.S. in the other hand. So what do you think about the leadership, especially at this moment with the Trump administration?
Trump administration, I think, has focused on a couple of countries and has ignored others. So again, they've only had a relationship or only invited President Kenyatta and President Buhari to the Oval Office. I think Kenya's relationship with the U.S. has grown and deepened. They're in the middle of negotiating a free trade agreement, which would be the second one on the continent following Morocco, and it is a big deal, especially if they get it right, which I mean, that it doesn't undercut the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Other countries that seem to have get a lot of attention from this administration would be Ghana.
Mhm,
Ghana has had the Commerce Secretary visit. Other very high level folks have visited that country. The U.S. is engaged with Ethiopia and Sudan, given the important transitions there. And I think they are continuing to work through issues around Nigeria. Just one last point. I think it's important to note where Secretary Pompeo traveled to. He went to Ethiopia, but he
mhm.
also went to Angola. I think that the U.S. sees an opportunity with President Lorenzo, and he went to Dakar
Mhm.
to recognize sort of the longstanding traditions in Senegal of democracy and good governance.
Yes, that was really a good point, sir. It has been because I think so. He having after 2 years, that was the first time he been to Africa.
Secretary Pompeo,
Yes,
yeah, in that job, that's true.
yes. So do you think the U.S. is investing more right now in Africa?
I think U.S. is focusing it's making a policy push to increase investment. So they announced a policy called Prosper Africa, which is intent is to increase two-way trade. They've created deal teams, so a collection of different U.S. officials from State Department and Commerce and Agriculture to work together to help find deals for Americans and then advocate on their behalf. And then the biggest, I think the most important initiative out of the Trump administration is the creation of the Development Finance Corporation, which brings a lot of money to the table for U.S. businesses. It's not exclusive to Africa, but the expectation is that Africa will be a huge part of the portfolio. So I think stay tuned. We'll see if this actually yields some fruit, but the intent is certainly there.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think the Trump administration should do more
With trade and investment or in general?
in general?
Okay, I think let's start with democracy and governance. I
Yes.
mean, I think that's the cornerstone for everything else, to have
Mhm.
more stable countries, to have more opportunities for investment. And for the most part, there hasn't been a focus on democracy and governance. It's happening at the embassy levels, depending on which embassy and which country. We've even seen some sanctions around corruption, around human rights abuses, but it's not part of a sort of a whole of government approach. So, I would really sort of amp up on democracy and governance. And there's a number of challenges, whether we're talking about Tanzania or Guinea
Mhm.
or Cote d'Ivoire, just coming up in the last remainder of the year, and working
Mhm.
through the transitions in Ethiopia and Sudan.
Mhm.
I think on trade and investment, I do like Prosper Africa. I do like the DFC. I think that it's not just about talking to the American public about African opportunities, but it's working with African governments to address some of the enabling environments. So I think there's a more focused effort that they could be engaging on, but also trying to break down some of the challenges that US companies either suspect or actually experience. And then the final, I think, bin would be around public diplomacy, public engagement. We talked a little bit about the lack of leader to leader engagement under this administration, but I'd also like to see the U.S. revolutionize, modernize its soft power engagement. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think we're doing enough to tap both what is remarkably dynamic about the African entertainment, pop culture, literature. I love Afro beats. I think there's some really great things that we could be doing to talk about why there's a connection with that music and US music. And while US audiences love WizKid, love DeVito,
Yeah.
love Burna Boy, and I
Yeah.
think we could be doing that instead of what we typically do is send jazz musicians or bluegrass musicians. And I've been really elated by some of our embassies during COVID that have been
Mm-hmm.
more dynamic and interesting on Twitter, trying to think about ways how do you engage people during a pandemic. But I'd like to see a lot more on that, relationship. Things like YALI, the Young African Leader Initiative, those things are great, and we should be building and expanding.
Mm-hmm. Yes, really good point. Yeah, it's really interesting organization. So let's talk about COVID-19, especially in Africa. We know that China has been doing a few things in Africa, especially about COVID-19. So can you tell us what US has been done to help African regarding the COVID-19?
Yeah, as of today, the continent as a whole is almost at 900,000 cases. The US has been the biggest funder of health strengthening investments for COVID 19. So I don't have the figures at my disposal, but they've pushed money to almost every single country on the continent, working with health ministries, working with the African CDC. So I think those are really important investments. I think that sometimes because it's money, it's dollar amounts, not things, that it doesn't get enough attention. It doesn't feel tangible in the way that China through Jack Ma is sending PPEs and masks, etc. But I think that that's really important. What I'd like to see the U.S. do is try to make that more concrete so that
Mhm.
Africans understand and appreciate what we're doing. I think that the U.S. military has been a really good tool for doing that because they've been, getting in their C-130s and landing on tarmacs and handing supplies over, and that's much more visual and tangible. I think that the U.S. should be working more with its partners. It's not just China and the U.S. that are trying to engage with African counterparts around the pandemic, but the European Union, the UAE, Turkey, Japan, South Korea, almost 20 different countries are helping here, but there's not a coordination mechanism. And I think the US should take a leadership role in doing that.
Mhm. Yes, talking about that, talking about China again a little bit, because some people think so. The competition is really good for Africa, seeing China there, seeing the US, seeing Russia, some countries. So what is your thought about that?
There's healthy competition, competition that Africa's external partners are looking to innovate and be dynamic. I mean, I
Mhm.
think that it's fair to say that the DFC that I mentioned earlier, the
Mhm.
Development Finance Corporation, is in part because there was a view that we had to do more globally because China was expanding. So I think when that competition creates an energy around doing better on the continent with our partners, I think that's great. I think that when the US views this as zero sum, that anything that China does is inherently undercutting our interests, I don't think that's very productive. We've heard from the African leaders that they don't want to see that as well. I think there are places where we should compete. I think there are places where we should be very concerned about what China is doing, and there should be places that we work together. I'd
Mhm.
like to see less competition during a pandemic, quite
Mhm.
frankly. I'd like to see us working together, not pulling out of the WHO, trying to figure out like what are the things that China's doing that and we're doing that are complementary.
So what about the development? We're not talking about pandemic. Let's talk about the development. How do you see the competition?
I mean, this is the United States is heads and tails above China when it comes to development. when it
Mhm.
comes to investing in AIDS, HIV, malaria, TB. Even though China has included that in its statements around its FOCAC, its summits, it really doesn't compare. I mean, the U.S. is by far the leader on these issues, and I think
Mhm.
China would like to do more, as they've suggested in their public statements. And there has been cooperation in the past between the two countries. So that is really a place where I think the U.S. will continue to be a leader. The USAID, which is the United States' aid agency, development agency, has a new way it thinks about working in Africa or working globally, which is called the Journey to Self-Reliance, which means getting countries to a place where that aid isn't necessary. I
Mhm.
think that just reflects an ideology of the Trump administration, but I don't see, at least in part because the U.S. Congress is so supportive of African engagement, I don't see that the numbers are going to go down.
Okay, so let me go back a little bit talking about democracy again. Democracy, especially we are seeing what is happening right now in Ivory Coast, in Guinea, my country, and some
Mhm.
countries they don't want to respect. They don't want to respect at all the constitution. So, what is your thought about that? Especially Trump doesn't. I'm not gonna say he doesn't care, but he doesn't have a view about that kind of.
Yeah, we've seen the US be really uneven around issues around democracy and governance. So we saw Secretary Pompeo make a statement when he met with President Condé about third terms. We
Mhm.
also saw him make a similar statement about backsliding in Benin. I think those were important.
Mhm.
We've seen less comments from the administration since the referendum. We've seen no comments about what's happening in Cote d'Ivoire. And
Mhm.
President Obama got in a little hot water for telling Africans how they should think about their constitutions and third terms. And so the way that
Yes.
I think about it in retrospect, and I did work in the White House during President Obama, but in retrospect, I think about it is that our statement should reflect what the African public believes and
Mhm.
thinks. Right? We should be
Mhm.
supportive with the African people in the specific country. So let's talk about Guinea and let's talk about Cote d'Ivoire. According
Mhm.
to polling, both of those countries support term limits, two
Mhm.
terms. I
Mhm.
mean, with almost unanimity.
Mhm.
I think Cote d'Ivoire is at about 80%, and so is Guinea.
Yeah.
So, we're on really solid ground, working on behalf and in conjunction with African, Ivorian, or Guinean civil society around term limits.
Mhm.
There may be other cases that isn't the case, and then I think the process has to move as it should, as long as it's following the rules. But
Mhm.
in countries where we know by polling,
Mhm.
reliable, credible polling, that there is opposition to this, I think that we need to stand up. And I
Mhm.
can point to you example after example where the U.S. has reinforced countries where civil society has stood up for term limits, and that's led to the defeat of term limits, whether that's Nigeria in 2006 or Zambia or Malawi or Kenya. We have a great tradition of working with African civil society when there's a true opposition to a third term, and when there's not, I think that we have to sort of stand by.
Mhm. So talking about that, you made a really good point. But just let me say something a little bit interesting. Most of the people, that's how they think. I'm not gonna say all of them, but some African people say that USA or some Western Union countries they should not intervene or involve about African diplomacy or African democracy. So what do you think about that again?
Well, I think that the first place is that the US should not stand on a pedestal and lecture Africans about anything.
Mhm.
Uh, Amadou, you live in New York. You know that this country, is under a lot of strain and stress right now, and its
Mhm.
adherence to democratic principles are, let's say, less than optimal right now. And
Mhm.
so I think that if the US is going to talk to Africans about democracy, which they should,
Mhm.
we should have a dialogue. I
Mhm.
think the US and US leaders should come to Africans to learn about
Mhm.
democracy and the challenges of making your country more democratic and to adhere to good governance, as much as the Africans may want to learn from us. I think we're all in a struggle to
Mhm.
improve our systems, and we can do that together, as
Mhm.
opposed to one country telling another country this is the way. But I
Mhm.
don't think that the US should back away from talking about democracy, in part because we know that 68% of Africans support democratic principles.
Mm-hmm.
So while the rest of the world is in a democratic recession,
Mm-hmm.
Africans remain strongly in support of democracy. So I think we're on good footing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the only addition to the way we used to do it is to ask Africans to comment on our politics. So we do a piece at my think tank called Africa Reacts, where we have African journalists and activists and academics give us their thoughts on, share their thoughts on our primaries, on our handling of the pandemic, of Black Lives Matter, on George Floyd's murder. So I believe really strongly in a conversation, a dialogue where not only are we providing some of our experiences, but that we are inviting comments on our own system and where Africans believe we should do better.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me go back again a little bit talking about China.
Okay.
Do you think so? You could be worried about China, especially we are seeing China is getting more and more power in Africa, kind of.
Yes, I think that there are things that the US should be worried about China in Africa. And I think this is where I depart from the Trump administration, is that the Trump administration thinks that they should be worried about everything that China does. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's, first of all, not very productive. You can't really build a policy on countering everything. But I also think that it negates that there are some things that are probably less problematic for Africans or for the US interests. So I think that there needs to be a clear focus on critical infrastructure such as ports, space programming, um, potentially things that would impinge on maneuverability and access for other countries. I think that we do need to take a look at issues around, um, around telecoms and Huawei and what are the counterintelligence threats and other threats that they present. And I think that while I don't see China necessarily as a threat here, I think the US should be doing a lot more in terms of building ties with African people. You know,
Mm-hmm.
Yali is great, as we talked about, but
Mm-hmm.
China now, more Africans study in China than the US. And I think that
Yeah.
for the long term for US interests, that's very problematic. So I
Mm-hmm.
think we need to be focused on what we're doing. And when it comes to economics and debt traps and all the things that people in Washington, D.C. like to talk about, well,
Mm-hmm.
I think that Africans are pretty clear about the risks that they're taking. They
Mm-hmm.
understand that there are strings attached with the Chinese projects, and I think the U.S. should continue to work with Africans if they're interested in help on making some evaluations on these contracts.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the African Development Bank, which the U.S. helps fund, has canceled three Chinese contracts recently for corruption. So there are ways in which I think Africans can get a better deal from China, and the U.S. I think the U.S. should be happy to help them do that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, really good point. So just let me talk about something really interesting to me and the most of the people is about agriculture. So what do
Okay.
you think about that? Because I think so agriculture is part of the things that will help Africa to develop. And look at Ethiopia right now. Ethiopia, they're doing very good, especially about agriculture. So do you think so US should invest more about in agriculture?
I think the U.S. should invest more in agriculture, but I think again specifically around agro processing, around industrial agriculture. You know, my only counter a little bit or nuance to that, Amadou, is that the U.S. and the international community have been involved in the agriculture game for a very long time, talking about green revolutions, and I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes. The numbers around how many people are employed in the agriculture sector are wildly inconsistent. So I think people sometimes point to a 70%. When you look at some of the World Bank studies, it depends on the country, but maybe it's closer to 50. And that 50 mark is really important because Africa is increasingly urban,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be 50% urban by the end of 2030. Many countries are already 80% urban.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we need to invest in agriculture, particularly around industrial agriculture and agro processing, to make sure that the yields are much better. But I think that our focus should be more balanced between rural and urban. And right now, if you look at the money that the U.S. puts in, it's almost exclusively around rural and agriculture. And that's
Mm-hmm.
been the case since the 60s. So I probably have time for one more question, Amadou.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And anything else would you like to add, sir?
No, I think that I'm really pleased that I could join you today for this. We have a podcast, Into Africa. I really support African podcasts,
Mhm.
and this is a great conversation, and I don't think it will be the last. So
Of
thank you for
course.
having me.
Thank you so much, sir. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you again, sir.
Okay, great. Have a great day, Amadou.
Thank you. Thank you.